Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett.
I'm Derek Van Gorder.
Today we're discussing Chapter 4 of Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth. The title of the chapter is Their Red Ink is Our Black Ink. So they are the government and we are the people, or the non-government sector. The idea is that when the government is in deficit, the non-government sector, i.e. everyone else, is in surplus. So this chapter goes over the sectoral balances perspective of MMT. And a question we can ask is, what can we learn by dividing the economy into a public sector and a non-public sector, and by examining the flows of money between them? How do we feel about Stephanie Kelton's conclusions? And yeah, so let's just get into a quote from the chapter. Here we go. Myth number 4, government deficits crowd out private investment, making us poorer. Reality, fiscal deficits increase our wealth and collective savings. So this is an interesting quote. There's a lot to it. The myth here feels like it's actually saying two things. First, that government deficits crowd out private investment. And then second, that crowding out private investment makes us poorer or is a bad thing, right? So in order to kind of tackle what this means, I like to start by thinking about resources. So there's a few different ways you can think about crowding out. So if we think about resources, both the government and the private sector spend money to activate resources in the economy. And we ideally want to find a balance of resource allocation that provides the most benefit to the people. Resources that the government uses are not available to the private sector and vice versa. So in a sense, resource use by one sector can crowd out resource use by the other sector. So that's the sense in which government spending directly can take resources away from the private sector. And maybe some of those resources are going toward investment in productive capital or something like that. So there's a potential trade-off there. If you're not up against kind of your limits, you're not using all your inputs to the economy, maybe there are some resources that you can activate as the government that actually aren't going to take away from the private sector because the private sector wasn't activating them efficiently anyway. But big picture, there's a trade-off, and it might not be one-to-one, but there is a trade-off there. So that's the resource side of it. And then there's also the financial side. So deficits are often associated with the sale of Treasury debt onto the market. And these sales do a different kind of crowding out. So when people talk about deficit spending, they're often assuming that along with that comes a sale of Treasury securities onto the market. So they're not saying, instead of saying that the government is spending a certain amount of money into the economy, they're implicitly assuming that there has to be this monetary policy side of things that compensates for what the fiscal side of things is doing. So there's an assumption that that you have to have some kind of addition of Treasury bonds to the Treasury securities to the market. So what's important to keep in mind is that it's not the deficits per se that crowd out the private investment in this case. It's the actual sale of Treasuries. So when Treasuries pay a higher interest rate than what the market is offering, you're not going to lend to the private sector at a rate that's lower than what you can get from the government. And furthermore, I would say that this is precisely how monetary policy controls inflation. We intentionally crowd out excessive private sector financial investment. And that can be a good thing, right? We don't want the private financial sector overstimulated, because then that can, create unproductive investment that just leads to asset bubbles and that kind of thing. If we're keeping the financial sector stimulated as a way of providing money to consumers, then we're not activating the financial sector for what it's supposed to do, which is productive investment. So you're crowding out something bad.
In summary, I think we could say that both statements under the myth heading can be true, right? And Kelton's response for her picture of reality, that's something that can be true. Fiscal deficits can increase our wealth and collective savings, and but that's neither of these are absolutely true. And so it's by taking the resource view, you can kind of see when, under what scenarios government deficits would crowd out private investment, and we could understand under what scenarios that would make us poor, right? But when you just sort of say as a blanket response, fiscal deficits increase our wealth and collective savings, you might be missing some of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And certainly in terms of the accounting, the government spending more money into the economy nominally is going to increase the amount of money that we have in the private sector. So that's kind of, if you want to just take the basic identity, that's always going to be true. In terms of making us better off, a fiscal deficit doesn't have to make us better off. But if you're creating this dividing line between the public sector and the private sector, yeah, a fiscal deficit is going to be private sector or a non-government sector surplus. The reason I say non-government sector is because maybe it's also the foreign sector, right? You have the United States government and then everyone else in the world, including all the other governments and everything.
Yeah, I guess just to underscore something else that you said, it seems like the flows of money obviously are what she's really focused on, but there's also the incentive to continue to flow money like throughout that sort of private sector bucket. I guess that's a way of describing what you were talking about, where like maybe you want to hold on to it in treasuries and not, or put your money into treasuries instead of something else. So it's those dynamics within the private sector bucket that are important to think about with this monetary policy. And that seems to be something that she doesn't really get into in the chapter.
Yes, she's really emphasizing the flows of money. So, just, isolating these two sectors and seeing, what goes between them, right? Where's the money going? But there's also really important things that are happening within the private sector, right? There's, most of the money that we have in our economy is not, it doesn't come from the government sector. It comes from private credit creation. It comes from the financial system, right? So that's not something you capture when you're just looking at what's going in between the private sector and the public sector.
And just to underscore that, the second thing I think that you emphasize that she doesn't get into, as I recall at all, is this idea that you could have too much private investment. Like she's trying to deal with the concern that there'd be too little with the deficit. And so, but she doesn't really, maybe she gets into it in later chapters, but she doesn't really get into the risks of too much with like financial instability, as you said, or just investments that aren't that fruitful, that kind of thing. So, and she's interested in wealth inequality too in other ways, but she doesn't mention that here in terms of overinvestment in the private sector either. So it's just interesting that she doesn't kind of talk about that possible downside here.
Yeah, that's right. If we can't issue, interest-bearing safe assets onto the market, then it's going to be hard for us to crowd out, the stuff we don't want in the private financial sector. Yeah.
She does, I think, explicitly say in this chapter how she reassures readers that fiscal deficits, don't have to or can't, interfere with. We can have all the credit, the private sector can have all the credit it needs and all the funds it needs to do all the lending that it needs to do, and an expanding fiscal deficit poses no issue for that, and that's definitely not how we tend to think about things here.
Yeah, I would say that, there's real constraints in terms of the resources, as I kind of just went over. And then there's the price stability constraint. So whatever the fiscal authority does, whatever the government does, the monetary policy has to respond in a way that keeps prices stable. If they don't respond in a way that keeps prices stable, then your money's not going to function as well. But it also doesn't get you around these real resource constraints. So if the government is not spending enough into the economy and not crowding out enough investment, then you have to create more, financial investment in order to prop up the price level, in order to prop up consumer spending. And the problem is, you might be doing this, if you're the Fed, you might be doing this to keep the price level stable, to prop up the price level. but it has an outsized effect on asset prices. So even though what you're targeting is the consumer price level, asset prices respond even more strongly, and you get these asset bubbles, that kind of thing. And ideally, you wouldn't be using monetary policy for this purpose. You wouldn't be using the private financial sector for this purpose. And crowding out that kind of unproductive investment or unstable expansion of private credit is exactly what you want to do in order to prevent it.
I guess that's another thing she doesn't get into. She talks about, like I said, she talks about real investment coming, like investment in companies and stuff coming from having, you know, enough finance in the private sector. But she doesn't talk about, I don't think she talks about the trickling down to people's employment and things like that. Although maybe she does, because she's very interested in employment. I forget, does she get into that kind of effect where like consumers are ultimately getting some of this money?
So I don't think she talks about that so much in this chapter. I think in previous chapters, she was talking about her ideal solution of a jobs guarantee,
Right.
where instead of letting the market or stimulating the market, potentially instead of stimulating the market to create jobs, you would just have the government pay for jobs directly.
Right.
And that is compatible with having a more stable financial sector on its own, right? Like, you know, we could give everyone jobs, you know, pay them to work. You know, maybe it's not necessarily the most productive work because we're doing it for a reason other than the product of the labor. But if you pay them enough, maybe you can tighten monetary policy enough to rein in the financial sector. Now, a problem with that is that MMT followers tend not to believe that higher interest rates will help with monetary tightening. They want interest rates to stay at zero, and maybe they want to kind of manage it through you know, macroprudential regulation. You know, what are financial institutions, what are banks allowed to do, and kind of reduce the amount of lending that way. So it's kind of this different perspective that they have.
One other thing that I wanted to say that I agree with her on is that there is a decoupling of deficit spending and interest rates. So you do see that under, let's say you have a financial crisis or coronavirus, et cetera, like you can have very low interest rates and a higher deficit at the same time. And we see that historically. And she's pointing out that you don't, like for high deficit spending doesn't necessarily drive up interest rates in a way that the Fed can't control. So they can target low interest rates at the same time. I think that's something that you would agree with as well, Alex.
Yeah. So the question is, what is the kind of interest rate that's compatible with a stable price level? And sometimes that interest rate might be very low. It might be zero, or it might even be, you know, theoretically it might be negative, right? And if you set the interest rate above that level, then that tightens monetary policy. If you set it or below that level, then that's more, you know, you're going to have an inflation, you know, so it's the usual thing that people talk about. You know, if you raise interest rates, that's going to be more deflationary. If you lower interest rates, that's going to be more inflationary. That's true. The question is, what's kind of the neutral or natural rate of interest that's compatible with stable prices? So the fact that interest rates have been low or zero, and we've had very high deficits, is not evidence that things don't work the way economists normally talk about it. You can't use that. That's not sufficient evidence. And I think it's fairly well understood that higher interest rates are going to correspond to tighter credit, and lower interest rates are going to, you know, borrowing is cheaper, right? More credit availability. So that's pretty straightforward. Let's go into the next quote here. In its most common form, the crowding out myth says that fiscal deficits require government borrowing, which forces Uncle Sam into competition with other would-be borrowers. So this is an interesting way of kind of framing this. So I think the crowding out mechanism, it basically works this way, that the government is issuing instruments onto the debt markets that compete with, you know, privately issued debt, or they compete with private borrowing. And that's totally normal, whether they're being forced, whether the government borrowing is forcing the government into competition. It's like as if they're kind of like beholden to this thing they don't want to be beholden to, or something like that. I would more characterize it as saying that when Uncle Sam wants to compete with potentially excessive private credit growth, that kind of thing, they would choose to do this, right? It's a choice to sell the Treasury securities into the market. And it's a choice in the sense that you want to do it when it's better, right? When it makes the economy better off, when it makes people better off. There's a sense in which it's not a choice. It's not a choice in the sense that you have to do whatever you have to do to keep the price level reasonably stable. So in some sense, you could say that monetary policy, or the sale of Treasury securities into the market and swapping that for base money, the green dollars for yellow dollars thing, you could say that is essentially endogenous to whatever the fiscal policy position is.
And that's a big difference between your perspective and Kelton's perspective, because she frequently says in this chapter, she says how, well, these are voluntary operations, and we could decide not to issue more bonds this way. And you don't really stress that. You will basically take as given the fact that the central bank is going to do what it needs to do to keep the price level stable, and that might as well be a real constraint in your view. And it doesn't really seem that way for Kelton.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's not a choice. You can't just let the price level do what it wants. So any amount of government spending, any amount of any mix or pattern of taxing and borrowing is going to imply some kind of response from the central bank, from the monetary authority.
But what she is trying to critique, and let me see if you agree with this, is she's trying, in the story of the loanable funds model, she's trying to say that people believe that there's a limited supply of dollars available to the private sector, and that by competing for that limited supply, by borrowing some of these dollars that are available that the government takes out of the private sector, that's what sort of drives the interest rates higher, and that's what maybe causes the crowding out. And she's critiquing that version of it. But if you sort of drop this language about the limited supply of dollars, and you reverse the causality and say, well, the monetary policy is driving the interest rate, and then that reduces the lending that's going on in the private sector, then the crowding out story makes sense. And a lot of what she's writing out here as a counter, as to argue against in the first half of the chapter, makes sense to me from the resource view. Like, these two things are in competition. And I don't know, do you feel like, is this kind of a straw man she introduces about this story of the loanable funds model where there's a limited supply of dollars? Like, do economists not typically think of it that way?
I wasn't going to introduce the term straw man, but I'm glad you did. I do think this chapter is primarily setting up and knocking down straw men. I think that's a big part of what this chapter is. The idea that economists think there's like a fixed amount of money that can be lent out or something like that. Most economists don't think that, but they do understand that if the government is promising a certain price on borrowing, and you're not going to lend to anyone for less than that, right? And that's not about like a limit to quantities in particular. It's just about there's certain borrowing that's just not going to happen in the economy because it's not profitable anymore. You can just lend to the government instead.
So what is the Steelman version of what she's going after, or is there not anything that is related to the kind of myth that she sets up in sort of intellectual or academic economic circles?
Well, the loanable funds thing is a thing. There's this, there's the idea of exogenous money versus endogenous money. So exogenous money is what happens when the government says, I'm going to decide how much base money is going to be out there in the economy, and then the private sector will issue a certain amount of credit, expand a certain amount based on that amount of base money. So you're setting the quantity, and then the price kind of adjusts, and the quantity of credit creation adjusts in response to that. So that's exogenous money. And then endogenous money is when the government targets an interest rate And then the quantities, they'll introduce as many reserves into the economy as necessary to keep the interest rate where it is. So various things might be happening in the market that would otherwise push the price of borrowing around, and you add and remove reserves, or you add and remove treasuries in order to stay at that price. So that's kind of more the endogenous money perspective. And it's not just different ways of looking at how the economy works, it's different ways of implementing monetary policy. And she prefers the endogenous money perspective. And I think that's an accurate description of what we're doing right now, right? Like what central banks generally do. They don't target a specific money stock, a specific amount of money. They pretended that they were doing that, or maybe they even thought they were in the early 1980s with Paul Volcker. But that's not the norm. The norm is that central banks target an interest rate, and they adjust that target around to make sure it lines up with whatever their inflation target is, and then the quantities kind of do their own thing endogenously. So that's more. Stephanie Kelton is right about that. It is endogenous in that sense, but it's also true that you can, if you push that price around, that changes the quantity that whatever quantity happens to match that price. Like if interest rates are twice as high, then there's going to be less quantity of credit creation happening in the economy to match that interest rate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I'm sorry. Can you just say one more time? What was what way would you use? What would you use to have an exogenous approach? Like, what would it?
That would be if the central bank says, I want there to be X amount of base money in the economy, and maybe I'm going to grow that amount by 2% every year, and then the credit markets will figure out how to price everything.
But how would you put the money into the economy, is I guess what I'm asking.
Oh, same mechanisms. So you just use exactly the same mechanisms that the Fed does now. It just, instead of targeting an interest rate, you're targeting a quantity of base money out there. So you're buying and selling treasuries, essentially.
But how would you know whether you've reached that target, or is that part of why it's not really used?
How can you tell how much money is out in the economy? So there are different measures of the money stock, and sometimes they call it the money supply. But it's not, I wouldn't recommend doing that if you're a central bank, because I think what matters, of course, is price stability, and the price level stability, right? And if you are targeting a specific amount of money, then a specific amount of base money in the economy, then you're not keeping the price level stable. You're not actively targeting that. You're not really targeting inflation anymore. You might have assumptions in your head about what the price level should do, that, it should be, a monetarist might say that, at least in the long run or medium run, the price level should roughly correspond to the amount of base money that's out in the economy. Or they might say, no, it's not the amount of base money, it's the amount of base money plus bank deposits or something like that. And that can be kind of nebulous. You can kind of get into a whole debate about that. But if you're actually targeting the thing we need, which is price stability, then it gets a lot easier to work backwards from that. Okay, what do we need for price stability? Okay, maybe we can lower interest rates if we need to prop up the price level, or we can boost interest rates if we need to lower it down. And that works for that purpose. The problem is just these side effects that it has on the private financial sector that are kind of outsized compared to what you're going for. I don't know if that, I guess, so right now, what we do is we make it really easy for the private sector to borrow in the name of stimulating the economy and propping up the price level. And, as I was saying, to the extent that we stimulate investment to prop up consumers, we're not stimulating investment for the purpose of forming real productive capital. So if you had a basic income, we're a basic income discussion here. So if you had a basic income that was high enough, that would allow you to tighten monetary policy, to raise interest rates sufficiently that you don't have these asset bubbles. So you're trading off one source of money for consumers with another. There's this, unstable trickle through the private, financial sector and jobs and all of that, versus just hand people the money and let the labor market do what it does and let the financial sector do what it does best. So
that next quote, but just really quick, just to underscore the disadvantage of having the asset bubbles, in case people aren't thinking of that, would be things like financial instability, like you have a crash and maybe even a recession and things like that, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, you get the increasing instability and you get the cycle of booms and recessions. Yeah. So let's go to the next one. As everyone competes for a limited supply of available savings, borrowing costs move higher. So she's actually, this is her characterization of the typical argument. With interest rates on the rise, certain borrowers, especially private businesses, won't be able to secure funding for their projects. This causes private investment to fall, leading to a future where there are fewer factories, machines, and so on. So this is almost exactly right. We want to neither overstimulate investment nor understimulate it. And if we're overstimulating investment, then pulling back from that means preventing asset bubbles, kind of what I was just saying. But except for the very end, so where she's talking about, it necessarily leads to a future where there are fewer factories. I would say that, well, that's only if you're, tightening so much that you're interfering with productive investment. So if we're just tightening the speculative stuff and eliminating that, that's a good thing. And maybe you'll even have more factories and machines and so on. So the idea, limited supply of available savings is maybe not exactly right. Yeah, so this is kind of like she's telling the exogenous money story, that there's a limited amount of money there, and you're limiting that, which kind of has all of these effects. I would say more what we're doing is we're targeting the interest rates, right? We're targeting the price, and that's what's getting our desirable crowding out of inefficient private credit creation.
In general, I think we totally agree with Kelton anytime she's suggesting that looking at like sort of taking a stock view of money in the economy and there being a limited supply of it, that's always sort of not super relevant. So that's really easy for us to agree with. But it's not a good critique of the idea that that there is this crowding out effect between private investment and government investment.
Yeah. And I want to point out that even in this story, it's not the deficit, taxes less spending per se, that's in tension with private investment. Two things are true. One is that government spending competes for resources with consumer spending, as I said at the beginning, and Treasury sales compete with private sector borrowing and investment. So the sale of Treasuries does redirect savings away from the private sector, but it's not about, there's a fixed amount of savings and you're going to run out of it or something like that. Yeah. Get to the next one here. Okay. If a balanced budget can deliver good overall conditions in our economy, that is full employment and price stability, then there's no reason to complain that the government has balanced its books. So I generally agree with this idea that your goal isn't to increase the deficit or decrease the deficit per se. What you want is the best outcome for the people, the best outcome for the economy. This is, Stephanie Kelton has this perspective that, full employment is a good thing. And that's also the mainstream view. So it's perhaps reasonable that she provides no justification for it. But it's not the view that we have here. The issue is just, you want to get the most out of your economy. It's not about putting the most into it. And what you get out is does not directly correspond to what you put in. And the relationship there is, well, how productive are you? And if you are employing people for the sake of employing them or providing them with income, then you're not employing them maximally productively. So maximum employment of labor or any resource is not really going to get you the best outcome for the economy. Like if that's what you're targeting, what you want to target is, well, are we, how close are we to maximizing our potential on the output side, not how close are we maximizing what we're putting in to the economy.
It's difficult to make this as a critique of MMT because it's so common and widespread beyond MMT.
Yeah, that's true. It is kind of the mainstream thing, and you have even models of inflation and how central banks manage inflation that look at kind of unemployment as the thing. And obviously, if you are overstimulating the financial sector to prop up the price level, there's a certain point where you can't go beyond that. And, you can look at indicators like employment that correspond roughly to reaching that point or something like that. Sometimes people call that full employment. MMT would take issue with that definition of full employment because they know you can employ people. If that was really your goal, you could do it directly, and not have to do it through kind of the indirect private sector labor market, that kind of thing. But it's still kind of this same problem that that is it's just the fact that that's even an indicator of us reaching a stable price level is a consequence of the levers that we use, of the mechanisms that we use to stabilize the price level through monetary policy. If you're doing it through on the fiscal side, then all of that is out the window. With basic income, you can get the price level stable, by ensuring people have enough money to spend to activate, the resources in the economy, but not too much. And the level of employment can do whatever it wants. It can bounce all around, or just keep decreasing. And that completely disconnects any relationship between, or any kind of causal relationship between kind of the employment level and the price level or inflation or something like that. So let me pull up the next one here. Imagine an extreme scenario where the government allowed us to keep every dollar it put into our bucket, never taxing anything away. That's like closing the drain in the bathtub and letting every drop of spending accumulate in our bucket. Before long, the tub would overfill and our economy would overheat. Inflation would quickly take hold as too much money sloshed around in our bucket. The right size deficit is the one that provides just enough support to keep our economy humming along without rising inflation. So it's important to point out here that whatever the right size deficit happens to be, according to Kelton's story, you could achieve that deficit without any taxation. So, you could just do it through government spending and no taxing, and just have a lower level of government spending or something like that. So it's interesting that she's emphasizing the deficit, but also emphasizing the need to tax it away, but also talking about like the ideal size of the deficit. It's not necessarily the size of the deficit that's the thing to pay attention to. Of course, if you're doing everything optimally, that will imply a certain deficit size. It will imply a certain pattern of taxation. But those aren't what you're going for, right? That's not what you're targeting. Size deficit. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's a little bit strange because those things presumably net out for this point. Like you could just have a smaller deficit and no taxes, as you said, and it's the same flow into the bathtub. So it's at other points, I think she's emphasized taxes as a way to deal with the problems of extreme wealth for democracy, or like as redistribution or something else. And so I think that makes a little more sense in terms of being consistent with the rest of her worldview here. Whereas this particular analogy doesn't really make sense because of what I just said with it netting out. So I wonder why she's doing this analogy here. It seems kind of contradictory to other things that she's said. Maybe she's just trying to simplify, but that seems a little odd.
Yeah, I think part of it could just be that she's trying to simplify. It's also important to recognize that any size deficit will cause money to accumulate in our bucket indefinitely in the non-public sector, the non-government sector's bucket. So what's important, so she's kind of emphasizing this kind of like, okay, there's this stock of money that's increasing and it can get too big. And that's more similar to kind of like the monetarist perspective of, okay, there's a certain amount of money that's appropriate for the economy, and we don't want to have too much. I think, when we look at the price level, what that is it's, the relationship between, it's all about consumer purchases, right? It's about, what's the average consumer prices? So that's the consumer spending goes in one direction, and then the production goes in the other direction. So the economy is this big complicated machine. We can take one slice of it and we can see a flow of money going from consumers to producers and a flow of goods and services flowing in the other direction. And that's what we're trying to stabilize. And what's happening outside of that can be really complicated. What's happening outside of that could be that somewhere in the private sector side of things, there are really complicated things happening. And part of that is that there's an accumulation of money within the private sector that's outside of this particular slice that we care about for stabilizing the purchasing power of the dollar. So I tend to first focus on the slice, and then know that there are things we can do to nudge consumer spending one way or another, to boost output, or to kind of keep these flows matched up with each other. And you can know how to do that without actually having a complete explanation for everything else that's happening in the economy. You can just know, oh, if the market is pushing the price level one way, we know how to push back, right? And we don't need to know why the market is doing that or the particular mechanisms for how the market is doing that. So rather than thinking of the private sector as kind of this monolithic bucket, I prefer to think of it as a collection of pipes with money flowing through them, and whatever the money buys is flowing in the opposite direction. And the most important set of pipes is then the one that connects to consumers, because that's how people receive the benefit from the economy. And that's where money gets its standard meaning and value from. So let's go to the next one here. Fiscal deficits have the potential to lift millions of small boats, but too often the benefits of Uncle Sam's deficits aren't spread widely throughout the economy. Tax cuts go disproportionately to the biggest corporations, and the wealthiest people in society funnel their riches into buckets while millions of families struggle to keep their boats afloat. So this is an example of, she's actually breaking down this monolithic private sector bucket, and there are buckets within the bucket, right? And maybe money is flowing into some of those sub buckets, but not all of them, and that could be a problem. So the reason why I chose this quote is because part of the implication here is that you can decide to have a deficit of a certain size and then figure out what to do with it, or figure out how to, whether you want to do it through taxes or spending or that kind of thing. I think it's really important that the pattern and distribution of government spending and taxation is going to determine how much of a deficit they can run. So it's not just having a deficit and figuring out how to distribute it. And I think she's actually, maybe I'm not being fair to her here, because I think she's acknowledging that. But yeah, if you ever get to a point where the government spends money in a way that claims more resources, then that just means that there are fewer resources left over for other people. And you can have, I talked about the network of pipes. You can have some pipes where nothing is flowing in them, and there could be, you could have consumers out there who are in poverty, and the economy would be happy to sell them something if they had money to spend, but they just don't, for example. These are the problems that the absence of an efficient mechanism to get spending money into the hands of consumers can cause. That's part of it.
So
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Derek. Sorry.
Well, no, just I think we straightforwardly pretty much agree with her here. And it almost sounds like she said this is a perfect setup for the next line to talk about how and a basic income can very evenly distribute the benefit that the potential benefit that deficits can provide. But it doesn't go there. But of course, from her perspective, a federal jobs guarantee is just like that. It's distributing the benefits of deficits to more people. So she does acknowledge when she's talking about the buckets that there is this breakdown here. And so, I think we can just say we agree with her on this point.
Yeah, I think we basically do. Yeah, I think you're right. I think I was being a little harsh.
I was just going to say that one thing I thought of when I read this part of the chapter was that, there is then a different degree of spending that these different layers of the economy do with the money. So one thing that she didn't get into is like, you could presumably adjust the deficit. If a lot of the money from your deficit is going to like really wealthy people who aren't spending it, then maybe you can afford to spend even more to try to get it to people who would spend it more. Now that has other problems, kind of similar to what we were talking about with using the interest rates to get money to people. Like you're kind of blowing up this one section, where wealthy people are just getting like a ton of money as you attempt to like, I don't know, get some of it down to other people. And that has issues. I agree with her that has issues for like democracy and other issues. So I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but it seemed like she was addressing how the money might go to different people, but not necessarily thinking about how that might affect the amount of spending that you can afford, given that those people aren't necessarily spending that money anyway. So there's this question of like who actually spends it and how that would affect price stability. Maybe she knows about it and it just doesn't get into it in this chapter because she's getting into other things. But that was something that I thought of when I thought of this point that she was making about kind of who is the money going to, how is it distributed, etc.
Yeah, it would be nice to have a clear statement from her saying, it's not how much we spend, it's sort of how we spend, and then how much will just sort of follow from that.
Yeah, and I don't see her emphasizing that.
Yeah, I think the key point here is, she's complaining about maybe money accumulating in places where it doesn't get to people. If it accumulates in one of these sub buckets of the private sector, where it never gets out to people and it just keeps accumulating there forever, then maybe you can run much higher deficits. It's not going to do any good for the people or for the economy, but it's going, like you're not going to, if they're not spending it, you can give them as much as you want, right?
Yeah, and I guess I just wasn't sure if that was her view or if she actually thought that it was being claimed for resources. Like those people were buying like a ton of yachts and like resources were going to them. You couldn't really afford to spend the money anymore, but it wasn't being allocated well with respect to human happiness because it's going to buy yachts instead of like feeding a whole bunch of people that now don't have food or something like that.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to the next one here. Whoops. The story continues that if the supply of savings is reduced, then interest rates will rise as borrowers compete for a dwindling pool of available funding, driving borrowing costs higher. So she's trying to tell kind of the typical, crowding out story. And I don't think that's quite right. It's not that the supply of savings is reduced per se, causing interest rates to rise. It's that the interest rate rise causes people to lend to the government instead of the private sector. So their savings are being redirected to the government instead of into the private sector. So just selling more treasuries onto the market alone, that will drive down their price. And it's not about the supply of savings. And if, if the government sells more treasuries onto the market, it drives down their price, which pushes up their yield, which installs a floor on private sector interest rates. And as far as I can tell, the reason she's telling the story about savings being eaten up and forcing interest rates higher is so she can debunk it, even though it's not really the story behind why interest rates are important.
I think that perspective is common, I guess. That's what a lot of MMT is built around, critiquing this notion. But I think we agree with her that the causality is reversed there. But more importantly, I think a lot of mainstream economists also understand that. So yeah, it is. I think in this chapter, especially in the answers that she gives later, which hopefully we'll get into, where she basically this sort of shows this is where the rubber hits the road, and that just stressing that Uncle Sam is not begging for money, he's the currency issuer, doesn't actually get at the heart of the objections, and it doesn't address the very real problem that expanding government spending is going to be taking resources away from the private investment sector. The benefits, the potential benefits and problems of that very real thing. You can't really understand that phenomenon if you're thinking, talking, if you're only looking at the two different private and public sector buckets.
Yeah. Here's the next one here. The financial crowding out story asks us to imagine that there's a fixed supply of savings from which anyone can attempt to borrow. So I think this is, where did I get this from? The wrong spot. Okay, so I would say that it really doesn't ask us to imagine that, and that all we have to imagine is that nobody's going to lend to the private sector at a rate that's less than what they can get from the government. So maybe we actually didn't need to do that quote because we just talked about this. So I'm actually going to skip to the next one here. Get to see how the sausage is made. It's not government deficits per se, but deficits financed by borrowing that supposedly leads to crowding out via higher interest rates. So I think this is closer to the real story, but I'd like to emphasize that the two are connected. So as I was saying before, any fiscal position, taxing and spending, is going to cause the central bank to compensate by adjusting its monetary policy position. If you guys have nothing to say about that.
No, I think we've covered this part pretty well.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So fiscal deficits, even with government borrowing, can't leave behind a smaller supply of dollar savings. And if that can't happen, then a shrinking pool of dollar savings can't be responsible for driving borrowing costs higher. Clearly, this presents a problem for the conventional crowding out theory, which claims that government spending and private investment compete for a finite pool of savings. So yeah, we kind of covered this too. The crowding out theory doesn't really claim that. It just claims that if the government sets a floor, nobody's going to go below that floor.
I guess we've talked about this straw man quite a bit, but it seems pretty different. Like the view that you're proposing is the real view among experts, and this view in the book seem pretty different from each other. Like if that makes sense. Like they seem like kind of completely different things almost, rather than like a straw man version of something. So how do you think it is that MMT and Stephanie Kelton are presenting such a different view? Like where are they getting this from? Or am I wrong that they're so different?
So yeah, I mean, that's an important question. You're not wrong that they're different. I think there are people who think about money this way, especially people who aren't experts on money. And it's also true that a lot of economists don't think about money, and they kind of defer the thinking about money to other people. So it's not, and then the kind of the effect is still the same either way, right? Like more treasury sales are going to, lead to higher interest rates, right? You're going to drive up the yield on the treasuries. And then it's all, so something that's also true about economists usually is that when they talk about deficit spending, they're not just talking about spending in excess of taxation. They're implicitly assuming that there's a sale of treasuries going on as part of that. So in this chapter, Stephanie Kelton emphasizes that, well, you're just adding money to the economy. How can that possibly be, something that crowds out savings? It's more money people can save, right? That kind of thing. But what she's maybe intentionally ignoring, I don't know, is that people, when they talk about deficit spending, they're not talking about just the spending alone. They're talking about the spending and what you have to do to compensate for that spending on the monetary policy side.
I see. And so but if you want, isn't there an option, and maybe you already said this, but if you don't want, like, for example, if you want interest rates to be low at the same time that your deficit spending, like, for example, right now or during the 2008 crisis, aren't there plenty of options for achieving that?
Yeah, the Fed can go in there and swap the base money for the treasuries as much as they want. When I say as much as they want, they have the freedom to do that. They have to do it in a way that keeps prices stable. If you need to have more treasuries out on the market to keep prices stable, or if you need to have fewer treasuries out on the market to keep prices stable, then the Fed has the freedom and flexibility to do that. But they have to be doing it in service of the price stability.
And one more side point, I mean, and I want you to get to the next quote after this, but so I guess it's part of the confusion that sometimes people use the word deficit spending, like various experts, to really talk about monetary policy, to talk about like whether you're putting treasuries out there, and they're not really using it in the way that, say, Congress would use it to be like worried about the size of the deficit. And she's kind of confounding the two here.
Well, yeah, I mean, something that's a little bit confusing is that there are certain things that the Treasury does that are equivalent to something that the Fed might do through monetary policy from the perspective of the private financial sector. So when the Treasury issues new treasuries onto the market, that's exactly the same thing from the perspective of the private sector to the Federal Reserve selling some of its treasuries off of its balance sheet, right? It has the exact same effect. So I think Stephanie Kelton actually does like to include both of those things under monetary policy. And there's an intuitive, reason for that, because then you're saying, okay, monetary policy is all about swapping green dollars for yellow dollars, and that's the monetary policy side. And then the fiscal policy side is the spending and taxing. Whereas more conventionally, I think people would say that the initial issuance of the treasuries is part of fiscal policy. It's the fiscal borrowing, and it's all kind of one thing. The deficit spending, or is the you spend the money and then you borrow the treasury, or in whatever order, right? So that can be part of the confusion too. I actually think it's intuitive. I like the idea of thinking about, anything to do with swapping treasuries for base money on the market is kind of in the monetary policy category. Ultimately, what happens is whatever the Treasury does, the Fed compensates for it, right? So if the Treasury issues treasuries onto the market and it's too much, the Fed will buy up the excess. If it's not enough, the Fed will let more onto the market. So it's ultimately determined. The ultimate balance is still determined through monetary policy, even though the mechanics might be not.
This is a good example of why I think it's useful to always try to find the simplest term, clearest term that describes what you're talking about, that doesn't also have multiple things it could be referring to. So I think we just talk about government spending. We use the word government spending a lot because that can be true if the government is also simultaneously issuing treasuries, or if they're not, or if they're doing the MMT thing and we're just spending, we're not doing those bond issuances, right? So and then people know what you're talking about. Whereas I think Stephanie Kelton and MMT love to just talk about deficit spending in general, and then there's these other questions that we have to ask, like which kind of deficit spending are we talking about?
Right, or they might just say deficits, which could also be a tax cut. Does a tax cut crowd out private sector investment, for example, or so yeah, I like to talk about government spending, and I don't really bring up deficits most of the time unless someone else is talking about deficits, like Stephanie Kelton in this book, for example. So let's go to the next one here. Uncle Sam is not a beggar who must go hat in hand in search of funding to support his desired spending. He's a muscular currency issuer. He can choose to borrow or not, and Congress can always decide what rate of interest it will pay on any bonds it decides to offer. So I'm going to say no, it really can't. So the treasuries are auctioned off, and Stephanie Kelton gets into this a little bit. She's saying that the people who buy the treasuries are strong-armed a little bit, and they have to kind of accept prices within a certain range or something like that. But really, there is a market mechanism here that's going to be involved with setting the price of treasuries. If you don't allow that, then maybe you're just not going to be able to sell all your treasuries, that kind of thing. But more importantly, this is what monetary policy is. You want to be able to move that price around, especially in the secondary market with the discount on treasury bills and all of that. So not every interest rate is consistent with. This is all to say that not every interest rate is consistent with a stable price level. If you set the rate too low, for example, by having the Fed monetize the debt, buy up too many treasuries, then you overstimulate the private financial sector, right? So and what the appropriate amount of treasuries is going to be on the market is going to be determined by the fiscal side of things. So I agree with, Uncle Sam is not a beggar who must go hat in hand. I agree with all that stuff. He's not like desperate for money or something like that. But his spending is going to determine what the mix is of treasuries on the market and what the interest rates are going to be, that kind of thing.
Is there a clear way of differentiating between, what the government can do and what it should do? I mean, does that clear it up? I think it's technically possible, right, for the government to do a lot of crazy things with interest rate policy, but it's not a sensible, economically sensible thing to do. So why emphasize it? Why say that that's something that we can do?
Yeah, I mean, if you're okay with causing inflation, then nominally you can kind of do anything, right? And I think MMT kind of has that in the back of their mind sometimes, or maybe Stephanie Kelton does, that like, oh, the government can always pay its bills. It's never going to run out of money. Worst case, you'll get inflation. Well, if you have a price level constraint, if you're honoring that constraint, then yeah, you can run out of money, because the next dollar you spend might dislodge the price level from where it's supposed to be, that kind of thing. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next one here. Whoops, that's the same one. So what is the relationship between deficits and interest rates? In one respect, there's an indisputable answer. Deficits push the overnight interest rate down. In a world without bond sales or some other defensive action by the central bank, deficits will drive the short-term interest rate to zero. That's because the deficit spending fills the banking system with excess reserves, and a huge increase in the supply of reserves will push the federal funds rate to zero. Yeah, if you assume a price stability constraint, a price level constraint, then there always has to be a defensive action by the central bank when the government spends above, what, like in order to keep the price level stable. So if you don't assume a price level constraint, a price stability constraint, then you get inflation instead of an increase in real resources being activated. So the idea that deficits push overnight interest rates down, that's kind of like the idea that, oh yeah, deficits are inflationary if you don't do anything to compensate. Well, yes, but you have to do something to compensate. Otherwise you have inflation. So this is why most economists, or a lot of economists, it's safe to assume that there's an issuance of treasuries, or that the mix of treasuries is going to be affected by deficit spending, or by government spending at all, right? So she's saying in a world without bond sales. So she's explicitly disconnecting the two right now. And this is something that people tend to tie together, and for good reason. So I don't know that this is really a fair thing to say. It's like, well, yes, if you just print money and add it to the economy without compensating for it, then you drive down interest rates and get inflation. It's true, but it's not. It's kind of talking past what other people are saying, I think. Yeah, and then she goes on to say that on the next page, she says, the point is that without some explicit form of intervention, fiscal deficits would naturally drive the short-term interest rate to zero. And I would say that, what she's calling the explicit form of intervention has to happen automatically, or bad things will happen. So it's you can't just say like, oh, without that, this would happen, or something like that. It's not really a fair point.
By bad things, you mean like there would be too much credit building up in the private financial sector?
Not only that, I mean, you can have that with price stability, right?
And you have ICU too.
Right. Here, you're actually keeping interest rates so low that you're going to have accelerating inflation, or, things are just going to get out of whack, in addition to the private financial sector stuff. Yeah, right now we have, because the government potentially is not spending enough into the economy, there isn't enough fiscal support for the economy. You have to compensate by overstimulating the financial sector. Now, if you come in and say like, oh, the fiscal authority, the government, we're going to spend more money, so it doesn't have to be like this anymore, but then you don't tighten monetary policy, that's kind of what she's imagining, right?
I see. And I think people maybe have a different intuition, because as you said, I think by your definition, we usually don't spend enough fiscally. And so we often do see very low interest rates and no out of control inflation corresponding with those. And we often see that at times where we're spending more on the fiscal side than we usually do. And so that certainly gives a different intuition than what you're talking about. So you're kind of painting a world where we're spending quite a bit more. Let's say we have a basic income, or if you're Stephanie Kelton, like you have a jobs guarantee, you have like a lot more fiscal spending. That's when I think the dynamics probably come into play that you're talking about, right, Alex?
Yeah, that's right. So let's do one final one. Yeah, it's going to be this one. In spite of what most economists say, there's simply no preordained relationship between fiscal deficits and interest rates. If the central bank is committed to holding rates in place or managing them lower, then fiscal deficits can't force them to rise, as the conventional crowding out story imagines. And I would say, yes, they can. If your fiscal deficits aren't forcing up interest rates through the endogenous monetary policy response, then maybe your fiscal deficits aren't high enough or something like that. Obviously, I don't like talking in terms of deficits because that makes it more complicated. But yeah, you can spend money in a way that forces interest rates up, and that's because the monetary policy response is automatic.
Yeah, I think the common refrain here is that a lot of these statements don't follow through. That conventional economists do sort of understand, do have good reasons for making the opposite statements here.
Yep. So yeah, I mean, I thought this chapter really kind of gets into some of the core things that we disagree about. I know it can look like MMT and basic income. Like, oh, MMT means we can issue more money and spend more money, and basic income, that's exactly what basic income needs. So it's a match made in heaven or something like that. But there are some core things that maybe just don't add up in the MMT story. And this chapter, I think, more than a lot of the previous ones, is highlighting one of the key things, or some of the key things that we might disagree on. So this is a great discussion, you guys. Next week we're going to be doing, so we're more than halfway through the book now. Next week we're going to be discussing chapter 5, Winning at Trade. So it's going to be the MMT perspective on trade deficits and stuff like that.
Great. Thanks so much, Alex. Interesting stuff.
Thanks, guys.